Hey everyone, welcome to the Func Med Nation podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Noseworthy. The views and opinions expressed by my guests in this podcast are not necessarily consistent with my own views and opinions. However, I do my best to be respectful of their views and opinions as they express them, even if they differ from my own. Now let's get to the podcast. Hey guys, Dr. Noseworthy here. Before we get started with the interview, I want to say a few things about my two guests today, who are Dr. Rob Melillo and Dr. Peter Scire. I'm just going to read you from Dr. Melillo's website to give you a little bit about his background, and then we'll talk about how he and Dr. Scire have worked together for many, many years. But in 2004, Dr. Melillo published Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood: An Evolutionary Perspective, which was a working theory textbook on developmental disabilities. And this book continues to be utilized at both a graduate and undergraduate level in universities around the world. Dr. Melillo's best-selling book in 2009, called Disconnected Kids, catapulted him to national prominence, and greeted with overwhelming positive response. The thesis of that book serves as the foundation for the work being done at brain balance centers around the country. And we're talking today about the third edition of his book, Disconnected Kids. Now, he's got a very rich background as an author, a researcher, a clinician, an entrepreneur, and so we'll just leave it there as his introduction. Dr. Peter Scire, you may recognize his name. I did a two-part interview with him not long ago where we talked about something called immunoception, which is a subcomponent of a larger concept of the brain called interoception. And Dr. Peter Scire is a fantastic clinician in his own right, but he's been associated with Dr. Melillo and his work for many, many years. In fact, being the owner of, I believe, the first three brain balance centers when that kicked off back at its origin point. Since then, he's become, let's call it, and these are my words, Dr. Melillo's right-hand man, so to speak, and he teaches at a postgraduate level with Dr. Melillo in what is called the Melillo Method, which is the upgraded version, if you will, of how to deal with neurobehavioral disorders and other neurological conditions that we see quite commonly in clinical practice from a cutting-edge science perspective. And so I'll leave the introduction there. Let's get back to the interview. I kind of want to split the conversation as best we can into two segments. One is Rob to talk about the third edition of your book, Disconnected Kids,
Okay.
and probably branch that out into a broader conversation about neurobehavioral disorders, and not necessarily confining it to children and adolescents, but talking about some of the things that we might see in adults that could be stemming from issues that they had when they were younger. But then maybe turn the conversation into a little bit more of a clinical conversation. And last time Peter and I talked, we talked about interoception and immunoception and the role of the brain in controlling immune mechanics. And I think that's just a fascinating topic. And it's, certainly something that we see in clinical practice all the time, issues with those functions. And we'll cover as best as we can. I mean, if you're feeling kind of generous, we could always split this into two different sessions, and I'm certainly more than willing to do that.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
No
So Rob, let's talk about your book. Like you wrote the first edition, I think it was 2009.
Correct.
And I did get that book and I read it then, and I've just finished reading the third edition, which I don't think is published yet. Is that correct?
It just came out on the 6th of August. So it
did. Well, yeah. Congratulations on that. And for those of who might not know, we're in an era now where pretty much anybody can publish a book, right? Because the whole self-publishing engine is out there. But it's another thing to be picked up by a publishing house. That's, I think, a lot harder than it was 20 years ago. And the fact that you are published by an actual publisher and now you're on your third edition, I think speaks volumes to the quality of the work, as well as the value that you bring to families that are struggling with kids and family members that have neurobehavioral disorders. So why don't you take just a minute to describe the concept of disconnected kids. And you can go back to the, what we all call the origin story. Like, why did you write the first book? What led to that? And
Sure.
maybe walk us up in general terms to now we have a third edition and you've, added quite a bit of new material to that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, my publisher is actually Penguin, which is the largest publisher in the world. And
Yeah.
I was told when I did publish my book for the first time that getting a book published by a major publisher was the hardest thing to do in any form of media, meaning it was harder than getting like a record deal. It was harder than getting a movie deal. It is, and it's even harder now, especially for for fiction. But yeah, so, and this is actually my third edition of this book. And then I have 3 other books with Penguin. So, it's been really blessed that I have that. And also the book is translated into 18 languages around the world. And so, it really all started with when I was working, developing work in teaching neurology and doing my neuro stuff. And, I was working a lot with adults, and we were, it was the early 90s, and in the 90s was a decade of the brain, according to Bill Clinton's declaration. And so all this new research was coming out, and I was really immersed in it because I was teaching it and I was starting to do some brain research. And, the idea of looking at the way the brain develops and how it works and how it connects and communicates, and the idea of functional connectivity really became a thing then. And the idea that there weren't really single lesions in the brain and that there weren't really a lot of genetic mutations going on, but that really there was just problems with the way that the brain was communicating, the way networks were connecting and communicating with one another. And something was disrupting that. And it wasn't completely clear what that was or how it happened, but it was more and more clear that that was it. And with new imaging techniques like fMRI and PET scan and SPECT scans and magnetoencephalography and better ways of like looking at EEG, became ways of measuring it so we could kind of see that. And so that was really informing a lot of what we were doing, and really the rehab component of how do you change that. And we started also understanding the differences between the right and the left hemisphere and how that regulates parts of the body. And initially, it was really just looking at musculoskeletal and maybe some autonomic functions, but not really looking at a lot of behavior and cognitive abilities and, personality and emotional regulation. It was much more simplistic.
Yeah.
But then, I came home one day and this was in 1995. And so I've been doing the neurodiplomate thing for, almost 10 years and, really doing high level rehab, but mostly working with adults and adolescents at the time. And there was a young woman there at my kitchen table crying, and my wife introduced me, and she was a mom of a kid with ADHD, and she was really struggling, and she was looking for something to help her. She had tried everything. She started a big group of parents and teachers. And so my wife suggested that, maybe she wanted to talk to me because I knew a lot about the brain, but I knew a lot about other stuff like nutrition and diet and other things. And so, I met this woman, and, my wife really kind of said to me, I think you're supposed to help her in some way. And I don't know why. And then a couple of days later, I went, and my older son, it was his first parent teacher meeting in his first grade. And I walk in and the teacher says, I think your son has ADHD. And so I saw that in my mind. At first, I felt like other parents, first I felt embarrassed as a professional who's supposed to know a lot about neurology and the brain, and I didn't really know what ADHD was. As most parents, I felt like, well, maybe I'm to blame because I'm working so much and not home and lecturing on weekends. But I also had a question that popped into my head, which is, well, what is it? What is ADHD? What is actually happening in the brain? And I went out and asked every expert that I could find, pediatricians, pediatric neurologists, psychologists, neuropsychologists, and none of them could answer that question for me. But all of them would tell me that I couldn't do anything about it anyway. So I was kind of like, okay, you just told me you don't know what it is, but you're absolutely sure you can't change it. So that's when I really dove into and immersed myself into the research, and really became kind of an obsession to me. And I, really compiled every piece of paper and data, and I went to the libraries, and, I eventually turned that into a book that I published in 2004, which was my first textbook, called Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood and Evolutionary Perspective, which was, a 500-page textbook that I had actually handwritten 1,300 pages with over 4,000 references at that point. So I really kind of knew what I was talking about, but also along the way, I had developed a program of how to not only help my son and this other woman's son, but many, many other children. And it's really been a lifelong journey of really trying to understand more and more and more. And, and we'll never understand everything about the brain, but there's, a lot more to understand and more tools and what to do. And that kind of eventually led me to put together Disconnected Kids, which was a book for the lay population to try to put this information in the hands of parents so that other people that I couldn't reach through my practice, or that other doctors that I was training couldn't reach, could actually have something that they could use at home. And from the beginning, it was really very well received, and it's been, a bestseller since the beginning. And obviously, having the third edition, it's even more popular now than it's ever been before. So it's still resonating at a high level. So we just came out with the third edition. I'm really happy about that.
So was it the compilation of additional research and just a reflection of your own ongoing learning process that led you to go, I need to add more stuff?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's a combination of, publishers, if a book is selling well, they know that, okay, at a certain point, we need to freshen this up, at a certain point, like, let's say you're 5 years in and people are still demanding it, we should actually come out with probably a new edition. Otherwise, some of this information might be getting stale, especially if they know that the person doing it is involved in research and is trying to move forward. But then also it was partly that I have been doing, a ton of research over the last few years, and especially my most productive years clinically and research wise really has been, since COVID and beyond. And so, for the past 5-6 years, we've come out with a lot of new research. And so we wanted to include that because we needed to update it, and in the area of the immune system and, how the brain regulates the immune system and how that relates to those issues. There's a lot of new information on that. So it was a combination of, there's a lot of new information, published a lot of research, but also, at a certain point, you need to kind of update things. And so when you do a new edition, it's got to be at least 25% new material. And we have more than that. We have probably 30-40% new material in this book.
Yeah. Do you look back at the first edition and kind of shake your head? Like, what was I thinking? Or, if I could write that book with my knowledge today, would you have done it differently?
To be honest with you, no. I look back and sometimes I say, how the hell did I write this book? Because I think it was so ahead of its time, really, that now it's actually coming into it. And that's why, and I really had the opportunity to do that, because when you write a second edition or a third edition, you have to go back and reread everything that you wrote. And after a while, you get sick of reading your own books over and over and over for editing purposes and all of that. And so you really get a chance with fresh eyes to go back and say, hey, would I really? And to be honest with you, no, all I see is that, wow, there's so much more I'd want to add to this and clarify it more and be more specific. But there's nothing that I look back and I go, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or I wish I did that differently. I just look at it now like, okay, now we definitely need to update this. But, I think it was relevant now, and it's relevant, and, it was relevant then. So I really just feel like, we just updated, and that's all we need to do.
Yeah. Peter, let me toss you a question and get you involved in the conversation. Like, if we kind of pivot off the concept of disconnection, which, Rob, I think you explained very well from a neuro standpoint. it seems to me that there's a disconnection between what's published in the research and what scientists know about how the brain works and what clinicians know and what they can, perceive in clinical practice. And then there's a big gap between those things and what parents understand. How would you describe that problem of these pieces being disconnected themselves? And then how do you think the work that you've done with Rob and you've done in your own practice starts to put those pieces together?
I mean, I think it's a great question. I mean, I really think there is this true disconnection. I think we hear that the difference between clinical practice and research is almost like a 10-year gap in a lot of areas. I think we always hear that, if not maybe 15 at best. So I think, for me, who was someone who originally started doing Rob's work early on, I was one of his early adopters of his work, would go out and do lay lectures to the public. And, at the time we were just relying on some research papers that were coming out like in the 80s and the 90s in the decade of the brain. But it wasn't until I think Rob wrote the textbook that you saw the culmination of all this research come together in one book. And then, at the same time when he wrote the book, there was very specific research groups that were actually doing some really good work in the field of ADHD and autism, specifically like Marcel Just's group from Carnegie Mellon, and then you had Eric Kristagi, and you had Uta Furt. So you had a really great pioneers, Martha Herbert at Harvard. Then you also had Jeremy Shamaman at Mass General that was really doing a lot of work. But it wasn't until I encountered Rob that all of a sudden you had a clinician who had all this background in neurological rehabilitation take all these concepts and bring it together. Okay. Yeah. And he did it wonderfully in the textbooks, but who was going to read this really intense textbook? Some of our diehard colleagues did, and maybe some parents would pick it up. But when the book came out, that transformed the conversation, I really believe, in 2009, because it went from, now where you didn't have to. I remember when I was first trying to get physicians to even be interested in hearing about his model, they were like, well, I'm not going to read a textbook, and at that point, he really hadn't published any papers yet. And so, I would give them some papers from the researchers that I was just talking about, and they were like, yeah, I'm not going to read those anyway. But you give them a small book. Okay. That was a game changer. Even for the parents that were physicians that brought their kids to us, how we even got to Harvard and got the relationship with Harvard, and McLean Hospital was because of that book. Okay. That, a researcher looked at the textbook, but then fell in love with the Disconnected Kids book and said, hey, this concept completely makes sense. And not only does it make sense, it incorporates all the different various aspects that we were seeing in these children. Because you got to remember that probably before Dr. Melillo's work, everything was modular based. Okay, just like Dr. Melillo was referencing in the brain research, where we were looking at a lesions or a modular aspects, we weren't looking at networks. Well, he was the first person that really took the big leap and said, we got to look at this as a network of networks on both sides of the brain, and really how are these networks communicating together. And so you had people in the academic arena looking at these as purely academic disorders or cognitive deficits or executive deficits. You had people in the behavioral arena looking at it purely behaviorally, especially in the autism community, looking at it either behaviorally or from a biomedical model. These were the camps. And then it was when finally Dr. Melillo came around and said, hey, here's a unifying theory. It says, this is the unifying mechanism for all these disorders. No one up to that point had done that. And I think that's right. What makes his research so groundbreaking.
Yeah. And, Rob, one of the things I love about the book is that I was thinking about this last week when I started going through the early chapters. And what you've done is you've taken what we might call neuron theory 101 and translated that into just common language, right? So that anybody can understand it. And, going back to this idea of the disconnection within our professions, where you have the scientists doing their stuff and you have clinicians doing their stuff, and then you have lay people who struggle to find answers for things that are really challenging for them. one of the big problems is that pretty much no matter what your credentials are, if you're DCs like we are, medical doctors, acupuncturists, whatever, none of us really learn the brain well in our basic training. And for most practitioners in practice, the brain kind of remains this mysterious black box that they know it's there, they know it's important, but they don't know how it works. And that's why I love the book, because like you said, Peter, clinicians can and will take that book and read it. And I would say get a better neurological education than what they came out of their basic training. Would you guys agree with that?
Absolutely. I agree. The early chapters of the book, he did a marvelous job, not only explaining the foundation of his principles, the 10 principles of the functional disconnection, but in an earlier chapter, he really goes into the neurology behind brain asymmetry, and then talking about how our sensory systems and how it's connected to the left brain versus the right brain. So I think for us, a lot of times we would have our parents, our dads. I always say in interviews that, dads would only say, hey, read these 30 pages. These are the most important pages of the book. If you read them, you'll get the fundamental, what's the problem? And then really ultimately, how are we going to fix it? How are we going to address it?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think, as you said, Steve, the combination of someone who does really, high level research, that really is a researcher, someone that's a clinician, those two things, you don't see a lot of that really coming together. You kind of see one or the other. And, and you can obviously see value of being able to have both. But then being able to turn that into also, how do you explain this to the lay population so that they can understand it and they can use it? And those three things really, for me, I from a very early point, that was my intention, that I wanted to be good at all of those things. And it's taken a lot of work. I mean, that's why, I've been doing this for over 35 years and I'm still working at it all the time. And teaching was part of that. And it still is part of it, because teaching helps to really tie it all together as well. So, all of it, from a standpoint of, learning stuff. And as you said, I think the biggest thing right now for me is that very few people really know the brain from a functional perspective, really at all. Even, the average neurologist doesn't know it at all. The average, even neurosurgeon, they may know some anatomy, but, and so that's the thing for me, because, when I see patients and they come from all over the world and people that have been almost everywhere, first thing I ask them, has anybody ever tried to explain to you what's happening in your child's brain or in your brain? And the answer is always 100% of the time, no. Yep. And, if I ask them, why do you think that is? They're smart enough to say, well, they probably don't know. And I'm like, you're right, they don't know. And so to me, that's where it starts. That was my first question, was what's happening in my son's brain, right? Yeah. And because how am I going to change it? Can I change it? And until that's answered. And so really, this has been a lifelong journey to try to understand that at the deepest level and really have a working knowledge so that it's what I do every day, all day. And if you were in our office, even my staff, I mean, all day, every day, we have pictures of the brain. We're talking about Brodmann areas. We're talking about different parts of the neuroanatomy. We're talking about right brain and left brain functions. And it's what we do. And that's the only way to master anything, is when it becomes part of what you do every day. It becomes a habit, and you're devoting thousands of hours to it. And I think that's the difference, really, is that, there are a lot of bright people out there, and there are a lot of people that know about this or that, researchers who know a lot about the brain, but they've never applied it to real live people or patients. You have doctors that know clinically what to do, and they have good instincts, but they really don't understand what they're doing. You have people in the biomedical world that understand, the body and the metabolism and the immune system, but really don't understand the interaction between the brain and the gut, and people in the psychology. So like Peter said, they're very compartmentalized, and I've really devoted my career to try to really bring it all together. And I think that's what makes the difference.
But when you put the book together in all of the editions, somewhere along the way, you chose not to simply write an informational book, but you wrote it in such a way to give people, parents of children with neurobehavioral disorders, some actual tools. You have checklists, you have inventories, you have exercises. And so essentially what you did was you equipped the do-it-yourselfers with basic information that they don't have to fly halfway around the world to see you unless
Right.
they feel like they want to. What was the rationale to include all of that stuff? Because some people would argue, you're only taking patients away from yourself, like as a clinician and, as a business person, as someone who provides healthcare. Why did you include that portion of the book so that people could do some things on their own? What was the rationale there?
Well, the broader mission was once I finished my textbook and I had written 1,300 pages and, read over 4,000, books and articles, I knew I came out of that and I was seeing something that other people weren't seeing. And then in working with it and developing a program, I knew I was getting results. I also knew that we were facing an epidemic that was only going to grow. Yeah. And so my first desire was, as a healthcare practitioner, as somebody who wanted to make a difference in the world, that I really had something to offer of value. And I wanted to get that out there to as many people as possible. And I tried to do it through teaching, and that was my first step. And that helped, but it wasn't enough. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, how do I get this to a mass group of people? And so a book, that was it, right? Most people, as we said, are not going to read a textbook. They're not going to read a scientific paper. So the other thing was, and I wanted to give them real tools because, and it's funny because, we had also been starting Brain Balance. We've been starting these centers where we were using this principle. So there was a business model as well where we were, increasing centers, and there were people that were involved and people that had invested in it. And a lot of people, when that book first came out, that were involved in Brain Balance, and Peter will remember this, said, you're giving too much information out. Like, it's too much. Like, you're giving them the secret sauce, right? and I said, and they said, it's gonna work against us. And I said, no, because people out there and parents, they're really smart. And what's going to happen is that if this book comes out, that it's just like a sales pitch, right? We're just giving them, this is the problem with no solution. We're going to lose people. They're going to believe that this is just like bullshit. They're not going to believe you for real. Yep. We needed to be fully transparent. We needed to be really authentic and really say, no, this is why I'm doing it, because we really do want to help you. Yep. And we're going to give you all the information. And if we hold back at all, people are going to know it. And they're going to say, this is bullshit. This isn't real. But when they read it and they go, wow, this person gave me everything. They really do want to help me. And then I want to see them. I want to do more, because they're still not going to be 100% confident that they're going to read through it and be able to do it. I really wanted them to, but I also knew that it would actually build confidence and credibility at a level that was more important than anything. And that would gravitate into people coming into the center. And to this day, in Brain Balance centers and even in my practice, the number one driver is absolutely the book, because of that. Sure. And that's because we did not hold back, and because we gave them real results. And I think that was, and that wasn't easy, because there was some conflict in the beginning over that, and not everybody agreed. But my instincts, I think, were right.
Yeah, no, I think you were spot on with that. Now, Peter, if I remember your story, you owned the first 2, perhaps even 3 Brain Balance centers.
The first 3 that were ever built. We started them together in Atlanta, and so I remember that day when Rob, told me we were writing this book, and he thought it was just going to really help the centers, but there was a lot of pushback from some of the earlier owners at the time that it was going to take away from the centers, and it did completely the opposite. Like Dr. Melillo said, it drove families to our centers. They became much more educated. So on the front end of coming into a center for an evaluation, they were so much more equipped to understand where we're coming from. Because again, here we were changing the paradigm here. Okay, I mean, again, for the last 20 some odd years of his work, we're going against the grain. I mean, we're talking about behavioral model being the dominant model in these disorders, and then the pharmaceutical model. Okay, so here you are being faced against two big groups for that people have been told, oh, this is the way. The drug model is the way, or the behavioral way, and so to transition them to this whole concept and to be able to simply go from like the idea that he wrote this functional disconnection syndrome to simply just say, hey, this is a brain imbalance. Okay, that literally one side of your child's brain is developing at a faster rate and one side of the brain is developing at a slower rate. And the goal of our therapy is not to enhance the more advanced side. It's actually to bring up the slower developing side to merge and integrate with the other side of the brain. That was a concept that parents got and then educators got. We would go and we'd do, I can't tell you how many times in the early years of when the first edition came out, I'd call Dr. Melillo up and say, hey, I just got asked to do a workshop at a school. I had several counties here in Georgia that brought me in and had me do continuing ed for their education all around the book. And what we would do is we would supply the whole elementary school with boxes of the book for every teacher, the principal. They all loved it. And then it just made its way from there to the psychologist, to the school psychologist. It just opened up doors that I think that initially we never thought it would. And to this day, it's doing that. And I think the best thing about this edition is that the first edition was the model of what he was doing and what we were doing in the centers. The second edition, he was able to publish and put in some of the research that came from the brain balance centers at the time. The new edition, what makes it, I think, so unique is that no longer does Dr. Melillo have to just stand on the work of others. He can stand on the work of his. And he won't say that, but the reality of it is that he's published so many papers over the last 2 to 3 years for his PhD on primitive reflexes. But more than that, been able to show, 15 plus years now, actually 18 years if our centers have been going for that long, the outcomes that we've been getting in the centers, getting in private practices that are using the brain balance Melillo method model. And that's where we're at now. So.
Yeah. And I'm glad you ended it that way, talking about the Melillo method, because Rob, I wanted to talk about the growth of the brain balance concept into this new model called the Melillo method.
Right.
And my understanding is that the difference, especially with the third edition of the book, is that you're bringing back into the brain balance model things that you developed under the Melillo method. So maybe it would be helpful for people listening, the lay people who are listening, to maybe do a very quick 30,000 foot flyover of the book in terms of sections and segments, just so that they can get an idea of really what the book is about, who is it for, and what type of problems are you trying to help people understand and address. Can you do that
Sure.
as succinctly as possible? Because we could we could spend an hour talking about each part.
Yeah, the book was really written initially with parents in mind. And it was directed and geared towards, children from, ages of, let's say, 4 or 5 up to, 18, 19, 20. And it was really at the time directed towards a lot of the kids that were like my kids, right? Who were pretty high functioning, that were diagnosed with, let's say, ADHD, maybe mild autism, but also learning disabilities, dyslexia. And it was about, trying to help those kids. And initially, I wanted to keep it pretty simple. And using the principles of the functional disconnection, try to keep it very low tech and very simple, and really make it something that was really affordable, that you didn't have to use expensive equipment. keep it more in kind of an academic education world. And even as we built the business, we didn't want it to be in the healthcare world. We wanted it to be really more special education, like academics, and not use, highly trained healthcare professionals. So it wasn't a healthcare model, and it was really designed to use some of the scientific principles to change the brain, but really geared towards kids and higher functioning kids, and using very simplistic ways. But as we were getting more and more results, we'd get parents that would come to us and say, well, my child doesn't speak and they're autistic and their behavior is really difficult and they're really aggressive, or they have a genetic disorder, or they have a brain injury, or what about my kids that have all these other metabolic issues going on? Or what about my adult kid now that is 30 years old and they're suffering? Or what about, my child that's 35 and has bipolar disorder or schizophrenia? And, that was completely outside of the realm of what I created in the brain balance model and the brain balance programming. But it was something that I ultimately always wanted to have an impact on. And so the Melillo Method was the evolution of that. And it's really a completely different model. I mean, if you come into my office and my clinic, it's completely different than if you go into a brain balance center. They're completely different models. For me, they're completely different kind of patient population. Most of what we work with in my practice is really non-speaking autistics of all different age groups, or genetic disorders, or brain injury, or adults with things like bipolar, anxiety, schizophrenia. We work with infants, and we use really high-tech stuff like the cutting-edge tools. And it's all healthcare practitioners. And it's a much more sophisticated model. It's a much more costly model. And it's, but we're trying to really say, okay, what do we do now with the most difficult problems in the world that nobody really can work with at this point, and kids and people that are violent and aggressive. And so that's the model I've created, and that's where the Melillo Method comes into play, using a lot of lab work, a lot of things that Peter's put together, really sophisticated ways of looking at labs in a really, functional neuroimmunological way. And, these are things that have nothing to do with brain balance. So a lot of the underlying science is similar, but the way that we've evolved into it and what we've evolved into with the Melillo Method is very different than what we really go through in that book. But we've incorporated a lot of that new information. Even the way we handle some of the things we handled before, like primitive reflexes, is completely different than what we did before, and much, much more effective.
Right. So I think what I'm hearing, and I love what I'm hearing, because if you look at all of these neurobehavioral disorders on a scale and a spectrum, if you have an astute parent who can pick up on the earliest changes that might signal an underlying imbalance in how the two sides of the brain are developing, they could use your book, do their own work, right? Do their homework and remediate their child and never have to go see a specialist.
Right.
Right. But then you do have these nonverbal autistic children, and you do have adults who had brain imbalances that were never resolved, that have sometimes neuropsychiatric issues. Those are much more complicated and complex problems that require a more complex and complicated model and specialized knowledge and expertise. So you've really kind of played both ends, right? You've got the do-it-yourselfer who's proactive and can take a book and translate that into something that's really going to make a difference on their own. And then you have all the way up to the point now, it's not just that you've added this to the book and you've developed this method. Now you're teaching clinicians, and both of you guys are doing that, right? The whole Melillo Method certification. So because I know, Rob, you've got 15 minutes before you've got to go. And I would love to schedule another chat because, like I said, I could talk about this stuff for hours. But can you talk a little bit about the clinician certification and training? Like how does that deliver? What could a clinician expect when they went through that training?
Yeah. So, I think my evolution has always been, to get deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And for me, I learned early on when I started talking about, even when I was, first writing my textbook and I started working with kids and I started lecturing to parents. I remember the first lecture I gave was terrible. I mean, I remember one of my staff members, I came and I thought it was great, of course. And I said, what'd you think? And they said, well, I don't know if they understood most of the words that you used. Yeah. And I said, like, what words? Like, I use simple words. They're like, what did I use? I didn't. And they said, well, even like cognition, most people don't know what that means. I'm like, oh, okay. And so it was something, I really worked hard at. And I kind of knew, Einstein said that the ultimate sophistication is simplicity. And I knew that, the only way to really explain it simple is that you really have to know it. I mean, you have to own it for you to take the most complex concepts in all of neuroscience and maybe in all of science. When you talk about how the brain works, it doesn't get much more complex. And you really need to understand it at the highest level to be able to really understand what you need to do. But you also need to understand it at the highest level to try to really make it simple. I mean, we all know people, and I won't mention names or anything, who purposely go out there and speak in super sophisticated terms that nobody understands what the hell they're saying. And people are like, wow, that guy's really smart, right? But to me, when anybody has to talk like that, it's because they really don't know it, right? They really don't know it that well. And so all of this has been part of that. In my course, it's where I can really try to go nuts, meaning where I can really get deep into it with people and an audience. Listen, I'd love to sit in front of an audience that has 10,000 people or 5,000. But the fact is, for really sophisticated information, you're going to have a smaller audience that's more sophisticated, right?
Right.
And they're going to really appreciate it. And we get these people that my wife, likes to refer to us as your neuro nerd friends, that we get together and we want to nerd out, like really at the deepest level, right? And Peter's been doing that with the immune world now. And so, we want to, but even that, we have to constantly remind people that, in a 150-hour course, even though we're getting at a fellowship level, it's high level. We want to it's still relatively simple from where we can take this. And there's, a lot more steps and there's a lot more training that can go on, but we're trying to give people really good understanding, working knowledge of the brain. But, and that's really where we've been at over the past few years. It's 10 modules and it really cuts on looking at specific conditions, but at the same time, building a really good working knowledge of the brain and the nervous system and the immune system and the interaction. And we give people real tools about how to go out there. And we have parents that take the course and actually can go through it and even become certified. But, it's really something that is meant to give people really high level tools to be able to go out there and really make a big impact. But there's a lot of other levels that it can get to.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm thinking just with the 10 minutes we have left before you have to go, instead of diving into the clinician side of things, let's keep it on the layperson side. Peter, with all of your experience, and I know that you've worked both with the brain balance model and now obviously the Melillo Method model. It's hard to say. What are some of the common patterns that you see when you evaluate a child that is somewhere on that spectrum, ranging from attention deficit, whatever, to really complicated autistic type behaviors? What are some of the commonalities you see in terms of left-right brain functionality that need to be remediated?
Sure. I mean, well, primary number one is the primitive reflexes. I mean, you're going to see them. Okay, you're going.
All right, so let me just pause you there and say, let's define that, because let's just assume whoever's listening has no idea what that is.
So these automated steps that happen developmentally in the first year of life, that there's a sequence of reflexes that are coming online in the womb that assist in the birthing process. and then set up the developmental stages of the brain and the central nervous system over the course of the first 12 to 15 months. And that by around that end of 12 to 15 months, those specific reflexes, these primitive reflexes, because they start at such a early part of development, and they are all found in the brainstem. So looking at that particular primitive part of our brain, again, they all should be inhibited by that end of the first year. And so if they're retained, what they basically do simplistically is suspend the development of the brain. And in most instances, it's going to probably suspend the development of the right side of the brain. Okay. So when we look at children that have symptoms of inattention or hyperactivity or any type of obsessive compulsive or motor tics or even Tourette's, social pragmatic type of problems where they have social communication issue, or as they age up, they don't necessarily have what we call pragmatic language, or the conversational aspect of language. They may actually speak and use vocabulary and spell really well because of the bias of the left brain, but in terms of understanding language or comprehending language, which is a primary skill of the right brain. So what happens in all these disorders is that we see these retained primitive reflexes. Now, the severity of the brain imbalance, the severity of the difference between the development of one hemisphere to the other, is probably also going to indicate the severity of the primitive reflexes. Okay, if the primitive reflexes are really severe, then the immaturity in the brain is going to be really great. Okay, and now what we'll see in a lot of children is that they'll be blessed because of some of the hemispheric traits that are actually passed on by family members that allow them to have an acceleration of one side versus the other. This is why we really believe that autism is what we refer to as like a geek syndrome, okay? That we see these very exceptional left hemispheric bias skills, even in all the non-speakers that Dr. Melillo and I are working with right now. They all have these tremendous left brain skills that we're actually seeing from them. And so that would be number one, is the retention of the primitive reflexes. Number two would be muscle tone. Okay, most of these children actually have various hypotonia. Some of them have global hypotonia, low muscle tone globally, but then we'll see patterns of this muscle tone, mostly in posterior compartments of the muscle system. Okay, and then thirdly, I would look at the vestibular system. Okay, and looking at how they have aberrancies in vestibular output from both vestibular systems. Either they may have, in most instances, hypoactivation of the vestibular system, low output of their vestibular functionality. Some children will have hyper, but the majority of kids will have hypo. And fourth, we would look at a lot of the oculomotor development of their eye muscles, okay, inability to have coordinated eye muscles in basic eye tracking or rapid eye movements, or the ability to converge or diverge their eyes. So broadly speaking, I would say those four major areas we're going to see are going to be delayed. And then as they begin to, let's say, develop the 2 and 3 and 4, when we should see more of their cognition developing, their cognitive powers developing, or their social pragmatic development happening around that, let's say 28 months beyond the 36 months, the 50 months, that's when we'll start seeing that delay in those functions as these kids are entering into, let's say, preschool, pre-K. But you're going to see the primitive reflexes, the low muscle tone, the hypovestibular function, the failure of eye muscle tracking. I mean, those things are definitely going to be seen below 36 months of life.
Yeah, and I would imagine it's each case presents slightly differently, even though the general pattern might be similar. Rob, I know you need to go in a few minutes, but with your perspective with this work that you've done, that the brain is massively interconnected and interdependent. If we look at the role that these primitive reflexes play in the developmental hierarchy, and the fact that if these primitive reflexes are not abolished, the brain delays its development, would you say, like, if we look at the Pareto principle, 80% of your output comes from 20% of your work. how much value can you derive from simply identifying retained primitive reflexes and then doing the work to abolish them, taking away that obstacle? Would you say that that translates into 80% of your results, or is that just step one, but there's an awful lot of more work that needs to be done?
Yeah, the way I look at it, Steve, is more and more I realize that there's interrelationship, which is probably the two founding principles. One is what we call vertical integration, right? The idea of bottom-up development and then top-down integration, and that there's this progression which is led and started by these primitive reflexes, and then, they should go away and all of that. And then at the same time, there's a differentiation with the right brain developing in the first 3 years predominantly, and then the
Right.
left brain developing in the next 3 years, so that we get this differentiation and the right and the left brain. And as they mature, they become more and more specialized and more different, and more demand to make sure that they are integrating. It becomes harder and harder to integrate them. And so those two things are intimately involved with one another. So for me, getting rid of the reflexes is foundational. If you don't get rid of the reflexes, we're never going to be able to fully integrate the brain. But if we don't fully integrate the brain or work to integrate the brain, we're never going to fully get rid of these reflexes. Those two things are intimately, and I think that's where I see some failures, meaning some people will come in and they've done years of primitive reflex work with other people, and the primitive reflexes are still there, and it's very frustrating for them at a strong level. Then I see other people that might have been going to people that were trying to do some brain integration, but and they may have gotten some results, but they didn't get complete resolution of the issues or as much result as they thought, and it's because they didn't look at the primitive reflexes and they didn't deal with that. Both those things are intimately important, and then understanding the neuroimmune piece, understanding the autonomic nervous system, the balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic, that is so critical. And all of those things are so intimately tied to one another that, that's the way I look at it. Those things have to go together.
Yeah. And so just to maybe encapsulate, on the therapeutic side, the most successful approach is multimodal, right? It's not just doing the exercises to get rid of the primitive reflex. It might be harnessing the potential of light or sound or movement or even cognitive challenges, right? So it's not just one thing.
Yeah, and doing it all together, right? Because the whole thing, the brain works and networks work in simultaneity, meaning that things have to happen simultaneously. All these things have to happen together, which is one of the things I think that was unique that I brought to this, was the idea of co-activation, or what we called same time integration in the book, meaning that it wasn't just about, doing eye exercises or light stimulation or sound or smell or movement or cognitive. It was about doing all of them together in a very specific directed way. Not just generally stimulating, but really trying to activate certain things and inhibit others, but doing it all together. That is also a critical piece.
Yeah. And again, I want to honor your time commitments. How much hope is there for parents of children who have these neurobehavioral challenges? And how much hope is there for an adult who may have had these challenges unresolved for decades?
I think there's great hope. I mean, that's what we show every day. I mean, we'll do 10,000 office visits this year in my one office, and we're opening up another office in New York City because, the demand is so great because the results are so great. People aren't flying all over the world and coming to see us at that level if we're not getting really big changes. Right. And so we see it every day, and we've proven it now in the research as well. I think hope is great as long as people start learning this stuff and waking up. And, we're stuck in these old models. There's a great paper recently that I just went through. I just did an IAFNR lecture the other day, and I talked about how this paper came out. Really, we can talk about it next time. It's so cool. The relationship between hypermobility and loss of and underdevelopment of proprioception, and how that relates to emotional feelings and interoception and neurodivergence, right? It was really fascinating. But what they say in it is that, traditional medicine is a blunt instrument. And traditional psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is from, the Journal of the Royal Academy of London. This is one of the most prestigious journals in the world. And they're saying that, understanding these things, we need to understand it at a refined level, because right now, all those other tools right now are blunt instruments. And unless we understand this and start to adopt these things, which, we're fighting traditional medicine, traditional pharma, traditional education, traditional psychiatry and psychology. If these things become adopted and people really, move forward, I think there's tremendous hope to really stop this progression of these epidemics and change things and really impact mental health in a huge way. And if we don't, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse, and it's going to be devastating.
Yeah, which is why it's so important to get the message out that there are answers, you can get results, and as a result, you can restore hope that your quality of life can be something that's worthwhile.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Peter, any final words?
I think he did a great job summarizing it, so we're good.
Yeah. All right, I'll reach out to you guys, and we'll set something up, and we'll record part 2. And I feel like we just got it started rolling on the really nerdy, cool stuff that we all love. So let's make some time to come back and finish that conversation off. Thank you, guys. I really, truly appreciate your time.
All right, Steve. Thank you, buddy. It was great. Okay.
Thank you.
Talk soon. Bye.
Bye.